There was an emergency meeting held at BYJU'S this last Tuesday, and it looks like some of the company's investors actually want to oust Byju Raveendran, the guy that the company is named after, out of the company. Specifically, it looks like there are a number of stakeholders within the company that had floated the idea of Byju Raveendran stepping aside, at least temporarily, to make room for an interim CEO while all of this controversy is going on. But of course, if this were to go through, if it were to actually happen, then it would require a pretty big internal battle between stakeholders voting against each other, not to mention that the Raveendran family owns a pretty big chunk of this business, and there are many people within the company who believe that the best path forward would be for Byju Raveendran to continue being the CEO of the company. Now, something else that happened during this extraordinary general meeting is that some of the stakeholders demanded disclosure of pro forma financials, and they also wanted to understand the end use of $910 million out of the $1.2 billion that were raised from the term loan B, which at the moment, the status of this $910 million isn't clear in the company's books. According to BYJU'S, the company, though, it seems like everything is going great. So they frame this as a constructive EGM with the company's 75 plus shareholders. Questions were answered with complete transparency. There was absolutely no discussion on the change of the CEO. They talked about early closure of their big financial audit, board reconstitution, process strengthening, and the Akash IPO. In other words, it's all business as usual. So I just can't but help imagining the inside of BYJU'S looking something like this right now.
This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently.
That being said, though, BYJU'S actually did have a much-needed win in Delaware, where the court actually ruled in their favor. The judge denied a request by term loan B lenders to investigate the matter of $500 million that were transferred out of the company's US-based subsidiary BYJU'S Alpha to other entities. Now, the lenders here wanted to put their representative, Timothy R. Poole, in exclusive control over all of BYJU'S Alpha accounts, including the account where the $500 million transfer occurred, but the judge said no. Now, just because the judge didn't grant control to the lenders over all of these accounts or grant them access to do their investigation into what happened to this $500 million doesn't mean that the judge is condoning the movement of this money or deeming it to be appropriate or not appropriate. That ruling hasn't yet come out. And she did actually side with the lenders at one point, ordering BYJU'S Alpha managers not to make any substantive changes at the company, and the judge has scheduled a trial to decide who controls BYJU'S Alpha later this year. Now, while all of this is going on over at BYJU'S, it looks like Unacademy is taking this opportunity to chart a new course. So by the end of 2024, it's very possible that about 50% of the company's revenue will be coming from offline centers. Also, by the end of 2023, they'll have gone from 10 locations at the beginning of 2023 to 58 locations by December, and they're expecting their revenue from this offline business to grow 8x. And also, the company is expected to break even by June. Okay, moving on, we here at Backstage with Millionaires are hiring for a writer/researcher role. So if you're the kind of person who is passionate about business and specifically Indian startups, if you're articulate in the way that you write, and also if you're able to turn data into stories and you want to dig below the surface, that's really important. People who are passionate about actually following those threads, going down those rabbit holes and not just settling for the information that's there at the surface when you Google stuff for the first time, then this position is definitely for you. You can find a link to the application in the description down below, and send us your best work. Just one piece on Medium or Google Docs, just something that you've written that you're really proud of, and we'll take a look and hopefully we'll get back to you. All right, next up, let's talk about Mojocare. So this is a company that has up until now raised $24 million, and they're basically going out of business. It's an e-commerce platform selling health solutions to conditions like ED, receding hairline, graying hair, PCOS, and dandruff. But in May of 2023, the founders confessed to selling inventory to relatives, creating fake invoices and inflating revenue. Following that confession, they fired about 80% of their staff. That's about 150 to 170 people. And it looks like now the board is actually going to be coming together at some point in the near future to talk about shutting the company down and returning money to its investors. And the sad thing here is that this is actually one of many companies following a similar path. We have Go Mechanic recently, Zilingo, Trell, and Rahul Yadav's 4B broker network. And then in a similar vein, we have PharmEasy, which is going to be the first Indian unicorn to go for a down round. They have plans to raise $2,400 400 crore rupees at a 90% lower valuation, which would put the valuation somewhere between $500 and $750 million, which is, again, a staggering 90% drop from their current valuation of $5.5 billion. And so far, the company has raised $1.6 billion. And the thing here, too, is that they actually really need this money because they took on a loan worth 2,700 crore rupees from Goldman Sachs, and they're going to be using these funds to pay back part of that loan. Also, take a look at this. According to the company's 2022 DRHP from their scrapped IPO, the founders of the company own 4.2% of this startup. That is a tiny amount of ownership in their own business. Now, I know that so far this news video has been all doom and gloom, but I have one little silver lining here, which is that India is SoftBank's best performing market globally. The CEO of SoftBank Investment Advisors, Rajiv Mishra, did a great interview with Money Control, and he said a couple of things that I think are worth highlighting. Firstly, he believes that India's per capita GDP will double, along with the overall GDP growth of the country. He also agreed that startups should be open to reprice their valuations, like, for example, PharmEasy, and go through down rounds, as this is kind of the end of the cheap money era. Now, SoftBank hasn't invested in India in over a year, and it's been more than 9 months since India minted a unicorn, and so the next thing that Mishra said is actually really interesting. He said that India is still a $3 trillion GDP market. It has gone ahead of itself in terms of valuations, and the total addressable market is not that big. There are 60 to 70 million people who have affordability, maybe a 100 million, but that's it. And we'll put a link to that interview article in the description down below. But I also want to highlight the ARK's breakdown of SoftBank's actual exits from the Indian market. Take a look at this. You can see here that they sold shares worth $525 million, $161 million, and $356 million in Paytm, Delivery, and PolicyBazaar respectively, with Paytm being a 20% loss, Delivery being basically a barely profitable exit, and PolicyBazaar being a 3x ROI. Also, it's worth noting that SoftBank has partially exited from Lenskart and FirstCry. Okay, now let's move on to some quick news items. First of all, Ola Electric is still leading the pack. This last month of June saw them with a leadership position in the electric two-wheeler space of 40%. Next, let's talk about IdeaForge's IPO, because we talked about this in last week's news video, but now we have the bird's eye perspective here. It was the first stock since the beginning of 2022 to achieve a 100x subscription mark on the Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange. And not only that, the QIB portion of this IPO, qualified institutional buyers, subscribed 125x, while shares reserved for retail investors were subscribed 85x. But why? Well, it looks like investors just recognize that IdeaForge has very strong business fundamentals. They recorded a net profit of 32 crore rupees in FY23 against 186 crore rupees in FY22, so they've been consistently profitable. And also, they have the first mover advantage in the drone space, which is actively being promoted by the government. And speaking of which, let's move on to this next topic here. The government of Himachal Pradesh has signed MOUs worth 200 crore rupees for drone manufacturing in the state. So it definitely looks like this drone space is heating up right now. And I actually want to talk about one startup in the funding news segment. But before we get there, I want to talk about Q1 of FY24, which just ended. We're now in the first week of Q2. So let's take a look at Q1 and see how things went. In Q1 of FY24, Indian startups raised a total of $2.748 billion. Now, a massive chunk of this, as you can see, was raised in the very first week of the quarter. We've got $884 million being raised there, and then ever since then, it's been more of a weekly trickle. This week, Indian startups raised $120 million, and a link to this chart, as always, will be in the description of this video. So let's dive in and see which startups have raised funds this week. The leader here is an edtech platform, Leverage Edu, which is focused on sending Indian students to study abroad, and they raised $40 million in their Series C. Then we have a jewelry startup, Giva, and an EV tech startup, Battery Smart, and they both raised $33 million. And then, interestingly, we have a couple of startups from outside of the typical Bengaluru, NCR, and Mumbai scene, so I want to highlight those. Firstly, there's Frigate, a Tiruchirappalli, Tamil Nadu-based custom online manufacturing company, which is amazing. I love the fact that these companies are coming in and allowing people to prototype easily. They raised $1.5 million in their seed round. Then there's Knocksense, a hyper-local commerce via content platform platform based in Lucknow. They raised $1 million. Then we've also got Pune-based alcohol startup Moonshine Meadery raising $675,000 in their pre-series A round. And then also we have this drone startup, Surat-based drone startup Inside FPV, which is India's first company to provide plug-and-fly FPV drones, and they raised $333,000. All right, that's it from my side this week. Remember, if you're a writer/researcher and you want to join our team, then you can find a link to the application in the description down below. All right, thank you so much for watching.